Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. On August 17, 1992, 11-year-old Holly Staker was babysitting a 5-year-old boy and his 2.5-year-old sister. After eating pizza, they went out to play at 8 p.m. When a neighbor noticed he was still outside, the boy said he was locked out. The neighbor took the boy to his mother at her job at a nearby tavern. The mother, Dawn Engelbrecht, contacted Holly's mother, and the two of them went to the apartment where they found the 2.5-year-old girl unharmed, but Holly was dead in a bedroom. She had been stabbed 27 times and brutally raped. In the days after the crime, JUAN Rivera was jailed on an unrelated burglary charge. Another inmate told authorities that Rivera told them he knew who had killed Holly. Police focused on Rivera, then just a few days short of his 20th birthday. Ultimately, Rivera signed 2 confessions to the crimes. He later testified at a pretrial hearing that he was coerced into confessing and had nothing to do with the rape and murder. Engelbrecht, whose children Holly was babysitting, had initially told police after Rivera was arrested that he had approached her outside her apartment on the night of the crime and asked, "What's happening?" She later recanted that identification, however, and said she believed Rivera was not Holly's killer. In 1993, Rivera was sentenced to life in prison. That sentence and the conviction were set aside in 1996 by Illinois' appellate court, which ruled the judge in the case had made errors. In 2005, new DNA testing excluded JUAN Rivera as a killer rapist, prompting a third trial, with JUAN, his family, defense attorneys, and supporters believing in his innocence, confident that JUAN would finally be released. On May 8, 2009, JUAN was convicted of Holly Staker's rape and murder yet again, even though DNA excluded him. Prosecutors cite JUAN's confession as proof of his guilt. Free JUAN Rivera. Joining me is my special guest, journalist and executive director of the Center on Wrongful Convictions, the Northwestern Center on Wrongful Convictions. Welcome to the program, Rob Warden.
Happy to be with you.
Thank you very much for joining me on this program. Now, you're the, as I mentioned in the intro, you're the executive director of Northwestern Center on Wrongful Convictions in Chicago, Illinois. You are also an award-winning legal affairs journalist who have been the editor and publisher of Chicago Lawyer magazine during the 80s. And you exposed more than a score of wrongful convictions in Illinois, including the cases of 6 innocent men that were sentenced to death. And in the 70s, you worked as an investigative reporter and foreign correspondent editor at Chicago Daily News. And you worked as a political issues consultant executive officer at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. So you have a lot of experience journalistically, you have some experience politically, and so you don't come to this, like I had mentioned when I spoke to you, from any kind of naivety whatsoever. How did you get involved with this organization? When did you become involved with this organization, Rob?
Well, in 1998, we had a conference at Northwestern University called the National Conference on Wrongful Convictions and the Death Penalty.
Right.
This was, an amazing event, and I think that we basically persuaded much of the media at that point that this was really a serious problem, that we were convicting people of crimes they didn't commit. We had 30 people here who had been convicted and sentenced to death for crimes that they didn't commit. And although 30 might seem like a fairly small number in the scheme of things, once the media got to interview these people and see basically grew out of that.
Okay, and now your journalistic, investigative journalism, your background in that, you obviously saw the good, the bad, and the ugly, but you saw particularly cases where you thought there were wrongful convictions, and that's what helped you make your decision to become involved, much more involved, we'll say. Now, this JUAN Rivera case, when did this come to the attention of your organization? When and why?
Well, we got involved in this case only in 2006. This was, long after JUAN Rivera had been convicted the first time. We thought that this was a compelling case of actual innocence. We had done a great deal of work on the issue of false confessions, and it appeared that the false confession on which this conviction was based was, just really, incredible. Now, of all of the issues that lead to erroneous convictions, the one that is most difficult for most of us to comprehend is the false confession.
Right.
Well, we can't imagine that we'd ever confess to a crime we didn't commit, and therefore we can't imagine that anyone else would either. But the psychological techniques that are taught in police academies and that lead to false confessions are really, if not ubiquitous, at least certainly quite common.
Right.
And this case, this confession, appeared to have all of the hallmarks of a false confession. So we got involved in the case, and because the victim was an 11-year-old girl, she'd been raped and murdered, and there was DNA evidence in the case. We got the DNA evidence tested, and JUAN Rivera was eliminated as the source of the DNA evidence in this case. Furthermore, JUAN had been on electronic home monitoring at the time the crime occurred. He had been involved in a burglary. He had broken into a car to steal a stereo, and consequently, he couldn't possibly have committed the crime. Those are the issues that basically got us involved. Now, once we got the DNA, and then JUAN got a new trial, we were shocked that the state's attorney in Lake County, Illinois, decided that he was going to retry the case. And
right.
We went to trial with it. And because of a number of pretrial rulings that were adverse to our position, and we think absolutely unreasonable and illegal, they were able to persuade a jury for the third time that JUAN Rivera had committed this crime. This is not just a matter of prosecutorial overreaching; it's a matter of absolute, incredible, judicial error. JUAN could not possibly have committed this crime because of the electronic home monitoring device. He was 2 miles away at the time the crime occurred, and yet the judge allowed the prosecution to tell the jury that sometimes the electronic home monitoring equipment had malfunctioned. Now, there was absolutely no issue in this case. There was no indication in this case that the electronic home monitoring equipment that JUAN had malfunctioned. In fact, it had, there are tests that occur routinely, and a few hours before the crime and a few hours after the crime, his equipment was functioning properly. and yet the judge allowed the prosecution to suggest that. And then when we could show that the DNA didn't match, that he could not possibly have been responsible for this, the judge allowed the prosecution to suggest two things that were just absolutely preposterous. First, that the DNA sample could have been contaminated. Now, that was absolutely impossible because the DNA in this case came from sperm heads, and you can't change the DNA of a sperm head no matter what. It's impossible. The only way you could do it would be to have inserted sperm from someone else into the sample that was tested. That's ridiculous. The other explanation that the judge allowed the prosecution to advance was that this 11-year-old victim might have been sexually active, and therefore the DNA that was recovered from inside her body might have occurred from a consensual sexual encounter that was unrelated to the crime itself. That was another preposterous suggestion, and yet the judge allowed them to do it. And what we have in Lake County, Illinois, and this is a county just north of Cook. It's between Chicago and the Wisconsin line, is just really a conspiracy on behalf of what's called the Lake County Major Crimes Task Force, the state's attorney there, a man named Mike Waller, and of course, and the court. I mean, it's all three of them. It is a criminal conspiracy, and I don't make those kinds of allegations lightly, but it's simply outrageous, and there ought to be a federal investigation on all levels in Lake County, Illinois. It's simply unconscionable what's been going on there.
Well, those are, like you mentioned, those are heavy claims when you're saying a criminal conspiracy. So you either have to have some evidence. So we're going to go through a little bit of that. I have some questions for you.
Sure.
Just one. I think a lot of people watch TV. We see DNA, but this is what I'm interested in. Just to start, when you talked about how the judge allowed the prosecution to introduce the theory, because there was no evidence that there was any consensual sexual relationship that the 11-year-old had, right? There was no evidence of that, but it was made the theory that she could have had consensual relationship, and there could have been another DNA semen sample there.
Right.
But why on TV you would see that there would be a clear separation when they did the testing between the two DNA samples? How was this theory supposed to work? His DNA was still not Juan Rivera's DNA was not found in her body. I don't understand how that DNA could have been interfered with from another possible semen donor. Can you explain that to us?
It simply could not have. And that's one of the things that's so outrageous about what the judge allowed the prosecution to get away with suggesting to the jury in this case. And of course, what the real problem was here that was the confession itself, and I think that most jurors, like most of us, can't imagine why somebody would confess to a crime he or she did not commit. And in this case, the confession followed 27 hours of interrogation. That was the marathon session. But Juan had been in custody for several days. He had been questioned repeatedly. He had been lied to. He had been told that he had failed a polygraph test. And at some point, he just basically gave up. Now, he signed ultimately two confessions. The first confession made no sense at all. there were no facts in the confession that related to the crime. And when the prosecutor, this is Mike Waller, the state's attorney of Lake County, Illinois, saw this first confession, he told the police, "This is no good. You got to go back and get something more that has some facts of the crime in it." Well, indeed, they went back and they got a confession that had all of the facts of the crime in it, but these were facts that were known not only to the killer, but were known to the police as well. And then one of the awful things about this in the final trial is that the police who took this confession got on the stand and said that Juan Rivera revealed facts that they did not know until he revealed them. It was an absolute lie. There is absolutely no question that there was no fact in this confession that was not known to the police. And when I say, and I'm telling you, the judge in this case was just absolutely corrupt. He refused to allow the defense to introduce evidence that the police had all of this evidence. He let them get away with that lie. He covered it up, and it is an absolute disgrace to the system of criminal justice that we have in the United States. It's just amazing. I can't tell you how bad it is. Lake County, Illinois, is an absolute cesspool of judicial corruption.
No, sorry for interrupting you.
That's fine.
Now, I want to say, when you talk about corruption, you talk about conspiracy, you're going to have to explain a little bit more for our audience here. What would be, because basically you can't get to the motivation behind why these people would do this, but you can speculate. I mean, certainly, you talk about the police. Why in this particular case? Because we're talking about now motivation changes from the first trial to the second trial, the third trial. What was the motivation in the very first place? What was the political climate at the time when Juan Rivera was arrested? But more importantly, what we haven't fully explained whatsoever the conditions on which Juan Rivera did confess, how he came to the police's attention. He didn't get arrested by virtue of an investigation by the police.
Right.
It became more of other circumstances. So please explain those circumstances. The jailhouse informant that came forward, was there any reward for his involvement? Was there any incentive that he potentially could have had? Any reason why he would have said this if it were not true? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think that those are extremely important questions. First of all, at the very beginning, this was a horrendous crime. The rape and murder of an 11-year-old girl in the city of Waukegan. And every time you have a crime of that magnitude, there is tremendous pressure on police and prosecutors to solve the crime. Juan Rivera was not initially a suspect. He was not a suspect until a person with whom, I said earlier that he had committed a burglary of an automobile. He was ultimately put into prison for that crime, and he's in prison for this burglary of an automobile. When someone, a man who was in prison with him, comes forward and tells the prosecution and the police that Juan Rivera knew something about the murder of this victim. Her name was Holly Staker. She was, as I said earlier, 11 years old. Well, Juan Rivera didn't really know anything at all about this murder, but he had apparently, talked about the crime in prison. And so, because of this tip from somebody who was in prison, the police went down to prison and interrogated him. And of course, he denied any knowledge, and they brought him back out of the state prison to talk to him again and again and again. And that's where this incredible incredible interrogation took place in which he wound up admitting that he had committed the crime. Now, as I said earlier, the idea of a false confession is pretty hard for most people to understand. But, we have seen it with such frequency in the American criminal justice system that we know that confessions are really unreliable, particularly, a confession like this. Juan Rivera had been observed, and this is according to a nurse in the jail at the time this occurred, that after he confessed, he was beating his head against the wall of the cell in which he had been held. He, didn't know, what he was doing. I mean, this is just, an amazing series of facts. And then we have, of course, the overwhelming evidence that he didn't do the crime. The DNA that excludes him as the source of semen recovered from the child's body, and the fact that he was on electronic home monitoring 2 miles away when the crime occurred. And yet, based on this confession, a jury was willing to convict him. It's just a totally ludicrous set of facts that led to what we believe unquestionably is a wrongful conviction.
Now, you talk about the confession itself, and you talk about an institution or an establishment called John Reed, and so they take him to a certain center, and there is a little bit of historical background to that center itself and the techniques there. But the thing is, I want to know, you do make the accusation about the police conspiring and that their statements were false and making false statements at trial later on the stand. So you talk about false confessions, and we have to take your word for it that false confessions occur and that they're very common and can occur. But for those that are still skeptical,
I don't think you have to take my word for it. I mean, I think it's fairly well documented.
Sure. What I'm saying is that this particular case provides us with a really good example of how false confessions. So why don't you tell us how you believe that false confession came? Now, you talked about him not knowing any of the facts of the case, but the police claim that he knew certain things that only the killer would know. Now, you talk about there was a first confession, there was a second confession. Please explain this whole thing, because there was they did have recording equipment at that time, or did have the capability to record the confession, yet they didn't. How did they answer to those claims as well, that if they wanted to add some credibility, they could have recorded it?
Well, now, in fact, since 2003 in Illinois, it's the legislature passed a law requiring that custodial interrogations be recorded start to finish. So that law was not in effect in 1992 when this crime occurred, and consequently there was no recording of the confession. And the issues here were really, pretty straightforward. The police claimed that Juan Rivera revealed facts of the crime that only the killer would know. And yet, we had newspaper reports. These are reports published in the newspaper that contained almost all of the facts that were in his confession, with one exception. And the one exception was that there had been a mop handle, a purple mop handle, that had been used to break into the back door of the apartment. Now, the police claimed that they didn't know about that mop handle until Juan Rivera revealed it in his confession. Okay. But in fact, Juan had been brought to the city of Chicago. He had been subjected to a polygraph examination, and the polygraph examiner had written a report saying that the police had told him, revealing that the police had told him about this mop handle, this purple mop handle. So the police, when the officers, when they got on the stand, and the principal officer who perjured himself, and I don't use that word lightly, his name was Lou Tessman, got on the stand and claimed that he didn't know about that until JUAN Rivera revealed it. Well, I can't prove what Lou Tessman knew or didn't know, but I do know that there's no question that the police in Lake County had told the polygraph examiner prior to that time about this mop handle. So I can only conclude that Lou Tessman got on the stand in this case and lied. It was a bold-faced lie, and I think it was very persuasive to the jury. Now, it might not have been nearly as persuasive if the judge had been a fair person and had allowed the defense to challenge this and to point out that indeed the police knew about this, but the judge didn't. The judge refused to allow that evidence into the trial, and that's what I meant when I say it is a criminal conspiracy that exists in Lake County, Illinois, and it involves the state's attorney, it involves the Major Crimes Task Force, and it involves the circuit court. It is an absolute outrageous situation that really should be investigated by the federal government or an outside authority, but it's apparently not going to happen.
Why do you? I mean, can we say that it's an unwitting conspiracy on some people's parts in here, or is there? What can you attribute this to?
Well,
the incredible ego. I mean,
there is a phenomenon. I think of that we call tunnel vision. That is that the police develop a theory that this person committed the crime, and therefore then they just for psychological reasons somehow are incapable of acknowledging evidence that disputes that theory. That's called tunnel vision, and I think that affects police and prosecutors and to some extent judges. So it's not always they didn't just set out to convict an innocent person. The machine was not designed to railroad an innocent person into prison. That was the effect, but they believed that they had the right guy. And then when the evidence that came forward that I think is dispositive that they convicted the wrong guy, as this became apparent, they simply didn't consider it. And so they just sort of, stuck by this original theory because they would have had to have admitted that they were wrong. And of course, when I say there's a conspiracy, this is a pattern in Lake County, Illinois. There are other cases that are almost as egregious as JUAN Rivera's case that have occurred in this one small county. And I can tell you about those if you're interested.
Well, let's get back to, because we want to be able to go through this, particularly, I mean, the first trial was bad enough. The second trial, the first trial prompted a second trial because they said there were some errors made by the judge. They looked at it again, convicted him again. You became involved because you saw this as a clear example of false confession based on your experience. And then we have the third trial. So let's talk about the third trial, because this is the trial that's really a travesty of justice. If you've got DNA evidence, you've got the law team that you're working with at Northwestern here, all of these experienced and passionate and totally convinced people that this person's innocent. Otherwise, you wouldn't be involved whatsoever.
Yes.
And tell us about, now, what I'm particularly interested in is the pretrial rulings. We have something called a voir dire here, which is the equivalent of pretrial rulings, where a lot of this stuff that you said that the prosecution was allowed to enter into evidence. Tell us about the pretrial rulings that you think were already set to sabotage this trial. What was done in the pretrial, specifically the issues that you thought were very detrimental to the trial once it did get underway?
In the first place, of course, we have what's called a voir dire in U.S. courts as well. That's something that's peculiar to Canada. And the judge had to rule that the confession was admissible. And in the United States, that the only test is whether or not the confession was voluntary. It has nothing to do with whether the confession is reliable. The judge held that despite these rather egregious circumstances under which Juan Rivera was interrogated, that the confession was voluntary, and therefore it was allowed into evidence. So the jury was allowed to hear this confession. That was, ruling number one, pre-trial, that the judge agreed that this confession that we think so obviously was unreliable was admitted into evidence. Now, in addition to that, the judge allowed, the state or the police to testify in this case that confession contained facts that would be known only to the killer. It was just so absurd, given the fact that, as we could show, that most of these facts had been reported in newspapers. The judge dismissed the newspaper accounts as just hearsay. That you can't allow newspaper accounts, into evidence. I mean, this is really, almost ludicrous for a judge to rule like that. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there's this single fact about the mop handle that was used to break in, and the police claimed that they hadn't known about that until Juan Rivera revealed it in the confession. That was a patently false assertion, which we can prove by the polygraph examiner. Now, the judge refused to allow that evidence to be presented to the jury. I think that this was just a totally disingenuous. A judge who would make a ruling like that under these circumstances has no business whatever, being on the bench. And this judge simply ought to be, drummed out of service immediately. But, the whole court in Lake County, Illinois, as far as we're concerned, is just corrupt. There are a number of other judges who have made equally absurd evidentiary rulings prior to trial in cases that have led to convictions that certainly have no veracity. It is a tragedy and a scandal, and yet, there's really no one to investigate it.
Now, when did the issue of the ankle bracelet technology possible malfunction? Explain how that evidence was introduced, because it didn't point to actual malfunction of his ankle bracelet, any evidence of that. So how did they get around that, and when did that come up, and how did they get that in as evidence?
Well, the reason that the first conviction of Juan Rivera was reversed was because the judge allowed evidence that allowed the jury to hear evidence that sometimes electronic home monitoring had failed. There was no evidence, of course, that it had failed in this particular case. Now, by the time we got around to the third trial, and this was the first time in which we had the DNA evidence that showed that Juan Rivera could not have been the source of semen recovered from the child's body, now, even though the appellate court had previously said that this evidence was inadmissible, when documents were admitted into evidence, the judge allowed testimony to the effect that it was that there had been failures in the system. Now, it's important to know here that the way electronic home monitoring works, it works, by a telephone. And if you stray more than 150 feet from the source, from the telephone, to which the device is connected, it will notify the police that you've gone beyond that. Now, furthermore, the system calls in every 3 or 4 hours to confirm that it's working. And the system was working very shortly before the murder of Holly Staker and very shortly after the murder of Holly Staker. So the only way that Juan Rivera could have possibly committed this crime was to somehow have slipped out of the bracelet, run a couple of miles, committed the murder, run back, and put the bracelet back on. It's almost ludicrous. But the way the evidence was allowed to be presented to the jury, it appeared that was a plausible explanation. And, the prosecutor in this case, his name is Michael Mermel. He is the head of the Felony Trial Division of the Lake County, Illinois State's Attorney's Office. He clearly, he must have known better. And yet what he did and what he told the jury was so incredibly misleading that it's just amazing. And the fact that the judge allowed this evidence to go to the jury explains, to my mind, how we could have a confession and have a conviction that was based on a confession that quite obviously was false, and that there was evidence that Juan Rivera could not have committed this crime, that the judge refused to allow the defense to present.
Now, we get to an issue that's still I'm a little in the dark about Dawn Engelbrecht, and she's the woman who brought this case to my attention. I was totally oblivious to this case whatsoever. So through her efforts, this case is we're talking about this right now this evening.
Yes.
So we got to thank her for that. Now, she made an identification of Juan Rivera and said that she had seen him the night of or shortly after the crime, and he said, "What's happening?" And then at some point, she recanted her testimony. And when I first spoke to her, she said that she got a rough ride from the judicial system because she did recant her identification, but she firmly believed before this third trial that he was innocent of the crime itself. So to explain, this must have been a complication as well when you have a witness say that she did see him, he did speak to her, and tell us what he was supposed to have said to her, and get that explanation for us about Dawn Engelbrecht's involvement.
Dawn Engelbrecht had told the police initially when she saw a photograph of Juan Rivera that she thought she had seen him on the street around the time of the crime. Now, that is, first of all, it's highly dubious because, to show someone a photograph and have them, make an identification and claim that this is somebody they saw, that's one thing. So witnesses, as we know, make mistakes about identification. But there's probably more to it in this case, that she was coerced basically into claiming that she had seen Juan Rivera on the street at the time of the crime. when he couldn't have been on the street because, in fact, he was on electronic home monitoring 2 miles away from the crime. Now, Don Engelbrecht, I think, ultimately realized that she'd been coerced, by police into making a false statement, and that's, of course, why she came to you and called this to your attention. That the police misconduct in this case was, simply egregious. Not only did they coerce a false confession from Juan Rivera, but they also, coerced a false identification from Don Engelbrecht. Now, of course, there were no eyewitnesses, to the crime itself. She simply claimed to have seen Juan Rivera on the street and spoken to him in the neighborhood around the time the crime occurred, and it's quite clear that she was wrong or was coerced by police into saying that.
So, at what point did she realize that there may have been some coercion, or she was, at the very least, that she was wrong in her identification?
Yeah, well, I don't know exactly at what point she realized it, except that she did. Certainly by the time we got involved, in the case in 2006, she was certainly willing to come forward and say, what we believe to be the truth, that she did not, in fact, see Juan Rivera on the street.
And her claims of how the police got her to do the identification, and her claims of how they operated and what you call the coercion, it really did support your idea that Juan, not only that Juan was innocent, but that there was a concerted effort to cover up certain information.
Yes, and as I said before, I believe, and I don't use these terms lightly. I am not a conspiracy theorist, but there is a conspiracy in Lake County, Illinois. It involves the Lake County Major Crimes Task Force, the state's attorney of Lake County, and the judges of the circuit court. It is an absolute scandal, and it is a conspiracy. I can't, I stand by that, and I wouldn't be making. I don't make these allegations lightly. We can prove it, and I would welcome if what I'm saying here is false. Let them sue us. Let them sue me. I will stand behind these allegations and prove them until the cows come home, as we sometimes say in the United States.
Now, with this false confession, what I thought was interesting is, and it doesn't make much sense for most guilty people to cooperate as fully as Juan Rivera did initially when police approached him.
Yeah.
And we also haven't talked about. It must be important. It was brought up, and you tried to bring it up as more of an issue as well as and also attribute some of the reasons why there was a false confession and why it's very valid that there could be a false confession. He has an IQ of about 79. For most people, that's kind of, if they know, it's borderline retarded, what's classified, I think, or very close to it. Now, and you just talked about a little bit about the psychotic episode he had right after the questioning.
Yes.
But the 26 hours, talk about this. You didn't mention the John Reed Society or the John Reed building that he went to for questioning. Tell us a little bit more about how you think a false confession can happen. The whole process, the 26 hours, he just wants to cooperate. Tell us how a false confession in this particular case really came about. Give us all the details.
Well, that's obviously because there was no recording. We can't really know, all the details of what happened in this particular case. But we do know that Juan Rivera was brought from Waukegan, Illinois, where he was being held, to Chicago, where he was given a polygraph examination by John Reed Associates. Their protocol is that they record these, but somehow they can't find or don't have or did not record this polygraph examination. So we really don't know what happened. What we do know is that, in the United States, I'm not sure how it works in Canada, the police can lie to you. And they told Juan Rivera that he failed the polygraph. Whether he did or did not is, pretty much beside the point, because polygraphs are junk science. They don't work. There's absolutely they shouldn't be allowed, but police are allowed to use them as investigative tools. These are not. The results are not admissible into court. But they can tell you, oh, gee, you failed the polygraph, and therefore you must be guilty. Now, that is, we're speculating here because, as I said, the interrogation was not recorded, so we don't know exactly what was said. What we do know is that polygraphs are absolutely unreliable, and that the police are allowed in the United States to lie to you, and they told Juan Rivera that he had failed the polygraph. Now, if the polygraph examiner told the police that, and that may just have intensified their interrogation and may have convinced them all the more that they were right and that Juan Rivera had committed this crime. But this is entirely speculative because we don't know, because they didn't. The John Reed Associates didn't record it, or somehow they have deep sixed the recording if they did record it. And
where's his lawyer? Excuse me, where was his lawyer?
You have a right to a lawyer, obviously, and they read you your Miranda rights, and Juan Rivera waived his Miranda rights, as people do in about 95% of the cases that we've known where we've proven false confessions. The police basically say, hey, you want to cooperate because a horrible crime has been committed. You want to cooperate with the police, and you didn't do it, and therefore you're very willing to, waive your Miranda rights. And
is that what typically guilty people do, though? That they waive their rights and cooperate as much as Juan Rivera did?
No, I think that that's not right. I think typically guilty people, people who have experience with the criminal justice system, are unlikely to waive their Miranda rights. And this is one of the insidious things about it. If you are innocent, you're obviously very inclined to waive your Miranda rights. You think, oh, gee, I didn't do it. They'll never prove that I did. And therefore, I don't need a lawyer. All I have to do is tell the truth. And, the questioning begins with, a period of rapport building. They may ask you about, sports scores. Hey, what do you think of those Chicago Cubs this year? Aren't they great? And so this is going on for a while until at some point it becomes accusatory. And at the point it becomes accusatory is where they start, really laying it on you. And you may resist and resist and resist for hour upon hour, as Juan Rivera did, and then ultimately, at some point, you just cave in and say, okay, I did it. And that's what we believe happened in this case, that he was simply, after 26 hours of interrogation, beating his head on his cell wall, obviously suffering from an extreme psychotic episode that he falsely confessed. And yet that confession is the entire predicate of his wrongful conviction.
Now, from that confession, though, there is some damning, evidence, but damning statements about why? What was the motivation for him murdering and raping this girl?
Yeah.
What did he give as his motive for the rape and murder?
That she made kind of insulting statements about his manhood. That he couldn't get an erection or something of that sort. These are and in anger, then he stabbed her multiple times. It's really pretty pretty ludicrous stuff. But that was the police theory. That was their story, and they're sticking to it.
What was his history? What was his background regarding violence or any crime?
JUAN Rivera had no history of violence. His only involvement with the criminal justice system was pretty minor. As I said, he was on electronic home monitoring at the time of the crime. He had broken into a car and stolen a stereo, and that was basically the only criminal history that he had. He had no history of violence. He had never committed had never been accused of a sexual assault or any other violent crime prior to this, and he became a suspect only because someone who was incarcerated with him came forward and said that he knew something about this crime. Now, he may indeed have made statements indicating that he knew something about the crime. I mean, that's entirely possible. And when he discussed the crime with police, he in fact made some false statements about knowledge of the crime. But this is not a particularly unusual thing. Once the questioning becomes accusatory. I mean, he's already boasted while he was incarcerated that he knew something about the crime. The police came to him and he pretended to know something about it, when in fact, he didn't. So in some sense, I think it would be fair to say that he talked himself into this situation. But you got to remember, you're talking about a man who had tested 78 on an IQ test, and who had no counsel present. It's a really pretty incredible situation.
Right. Now we've only got so many minutes left. We've got a few minutes left, but I want to know what you really think the chances are now of somebody reviewing. I guess tell us the next process or the next court that may or may not hear a review of what has gone on. Do you think you have a more compelling case now that?
Yes, we have we have an automatic appeal to the Illinois Appellate Court. It must be heard by the Appellate Court. It's not discretionary. They can't turn it down. They have to hear it.
Right.
And that will be heard within in the months ahead. Then after that, if we were to lose, and I'm certainly hoping that we will not lose, then we would go to the Illinois Supreme Court, and then ultimately into the federal system for a writ of habeas corpus. And I am confident that at some level justice will be done here, and we will, and JUAN Rivera will be exonerated of the crime that he did not commit, and brought home to his family. It's a really tragic case.
Now, how long is it? When was he incarcerated?
1992.
1992, and here we are in 2000.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so you say sometime possibly in the future, and then you really are confident that because this DNA is so strong and because you think the errors are so blatant, the pretrial errors and the errors at trial, that you think you really have something where Do you think it and not to say that there's any, there's any bucket at the end of the rainbow here, but do you think maybe there's a reason for this case going for the possibly looking at a more federal review?
Yeah, I mean, we're confident that that ultimately we will prevail in this case, and that Juan Rivera will be released and totally exonerated of this crime that he clearly did not commit. But it's going to be a battle, and the first step is the second district, the Illinois Appellate Court, from which the judges are under great political pressure, and it may be hard, politically difficult for them to do the right thing. But we're hoping that there's somebody there, that there will be, three judges on the Illinois Appellate Court who will see what an egregious situation this is and reverse the case outright without a possibility of retrial. If not, we're going to go to the Illinois Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, and then back into the federal system for a federal writ of habeas corpus. And at some point, I am confident we will prevail. The only question is, how long will these I can only describe them as criminals in Lake County be able to pretend that this is an accurate conviction. Now,
how involved has the media been? How much is this a story that's really resonating nationally?
No, that's the problem. I mean, one of the things Lake County. There is a local newspaper, the Waukegan News Sun. It's in the hip pocket of the prosecution. There's another paper that covers a little bit of Lake County called the Daily Herald. It's also in the hip pocket of the prosecution. It's outside of Chicago. It's south of Milwaukee. So there's no major media looking at this. And the media have simply been, absolutely disgraceful. The local media in these cases, and we'd like to. We would hope at some point that we will attract some national media attention, to what's going on. There's a kind of reluctance to do this. I mean, people think that, you have, awful courts in Texas or in Alabama, and that these things occur there. They don't think it will occur in one of the northernmost counties of Illinois. But in fact, that's where this case arose, and it's something, just out of the deep South that is almost unimaginable to think that it could have occurred in a northern county in the state of Illinois.
Now, you said that you thought this was a phenomena of, the tunnel vision, but a particular, and you said this, if this third trial is just a criminal conspiracy, but the reluctance for these people, because regardless of whether it's a conspiracy or not, if it is a conspiracy, these people then do realize that somebody's looking at them, somebody like you and your organization. Yes. So you're saying despite is there a real risk that if these people are looked at federally, that there may be an investigation into their actions? And that they're still scrambling to cover that up potentially.
I'm not so sure that that's likely that there's likely to be a federal investigation. But once Juan Rivera is released, there's likely to be a lawsuit, and he could basically Juan Rivera could wind up owning that county, because the damages here are so egregious. And I think on some level they understand that, and they're going to fight that forever, because what's happened here. I mean, what the police did, this coerced confession, lying in court, is so egregious that it's really rather, it could be a very serious problem for Lake County, Illinois, and they will want to do what they can to avoid those damages and to mitigate the situation.
Right. Well, I want to thank you, Rob, for a very informative program, and I want to tell people that they can go to Facebook and join the fight. It's called Free JUAN Rivera, RIVERA, and your organization, the Northwestern Center for on the Wrongful Convictions. Do you have a website that people can contact?
Yes, we do. It's centeronwrongfulconvictions.org. If anybody who wants to Google Center on Wrongful Convictions will find us. They'll find all kinds of information about this case and other cases in which we have been involved.
Well, I want to thank you very much for your good work, Rob, and thank you for coming on the program and explaining this fascinating and very important case of wrongful conviction and joining me for the Free JUAN Rivera program. Thank you very much, Rob.
Happy to be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. Have a good evening. Bye-bye. If you want to listen to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Join me next time. Good night.